He came home from war, but part of him never left. That's the thing nobody tells you about combat. They tell you about the danger. They tell you about the heat and the weight of the gear and the long stretches of nothing interrupted by moments of pure terror. But nobody tells you what happens inside a man when he has seen what Marcus had seen. Nobody tells you that your mind will keep replaying it at 3 a.m, in the grocery store, at your own kitchen table surrounded by people who love you, like a film that never stops running. He was 34 years old when he came home. He had served 2 tours. He had buried 3 friends whose names he still couldn't say out loud without his jaw tightening. He had a Purple Heart in a box in the closet that he hadn't opened in 2 years. And he was drowning, quietly, invisibly, the way strong men drown, with a straight back and a steady voice and absolutely nobody knowing how deep the water actually is. What happened to Marcus over the next 12 months is one of the most remarkable things I have ever been asked to tell. Stay with me. Marcus had grown up in rural Tennessee, 4th-generation military. His great-grandfather had served in World War II, his grandfather in Korea, his father in Vietnam. In his family, you didn't talk about what you saw over there. You came home, you squared your shoulders, you got back to work. Feelings were not discussed. Weakness was not permitted. You were a wall, and walls did not crack. He enlisted at 19. Proud, ready, built for it, everybody said. 6'2", broad-shouldered, the kind of young man who made recruiters smile. He believed in something, in service, in country, in the idea that there were things worth protecting even at great personal cost. He still believed in all of that when he came home. What he couldn't find anymore was himself inside it. His wife Lauren tried everything she knew. She was patient in a way that deserved a medal of its own. She gave him space when he needed space and tried to close the distance when he'd let her. She cooked his favorite meals. She learned not to touch him from behind when he was sleeping. She learned not to slam doors. She learned the quiet geography of a man who had come back from war and left pieces of himself somewhere in the sand. Their daughter, Abby, was 6. She had her father's eyes and her mother's laugh, and she would climb into Marcus's lap sometimes and just sit there, trusting him completely, the way only children trust, without condition, without reservation, without needing anything explained. Those were the moments that broke him the most, because he would hold that little girl and think, what if she knew? What if she knew the things these hands have done? What if she could see what's inside my head at 3 a.m? He didn't feel worthy of her trust. He didn't feel worthy of much of anything. The nightmares started getting worse in the second winter home. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom because he was afraid of waking Lauren. He sat up on the couch. Then the couch felt too close to the rest of the house, too close to Abby's room. So he started sitting on the back porch at night instead, out in the cold Tennessee dark with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in his hands, just staring at the tree line like the answers were out there somewhere in the black. He drank more than he should have. He knew that. He wasn't what you'd call a falling down drunk. He was too disciplined for that, too much of his father's son. But he drank enough to quiet things, enough to make the film in his head run a little slower. A buddy of his from the unit, a man named Troy, who had served alongside him through both tours, called him one Sunday afternoon in January. Troy was doing well, or seemed to be. He had gotten into a church down in Georgia, he said. He sounded different, lighter somehow. Marcus listened politely and then got off the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. Church. He hadn't been since his grandmother's funeral when he was 12. He associated it with suits that itched and long silences and the particular smell of old hymnals. He associated it with things that were fine for other people but had nothing to do with the life he actually lived. He didn't call Troy back, but he thought about that phone call for weeks, more than he wanted to admit. The night it all broke open, was a Friday in March. Marcus had been on the back porch since midnight. It was cold, 30 degrees maybe, clear sky, more stars than you could count. He'd had a bad one of the worst in a while. He'd been back in that Humvee in his sleep, back in the moment he relived more than any other, and he'd woken up with his heart running like he'd sprinted a mile and his hands shaking in a way he couldn't make stop. He sat on that porch and he thought about things he wasn't proud of thinking, about how tired he was. Not sleepy tired, tired all the way down to somewhere underneath the bone, tired of fighting something he couldn't name, couldn't shoot, couldn't outrun or outlast. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt completely defeated. And sitting there in the cold Tennessee dark, with shaking hands and a mind that wouldn't be quiet, he did something he hadn't done since he was a little boy. He talked to God. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't fold his hands. He just looked up at all those stars and said out loud, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I don't know if you're real. I don't know if you listen to somebody like me. But I got nothing left. I have run completely out of ways to carry this. And I need help. I need something I can't get from a bottle or a therapist or trying harder. I need something I don't even have a word for." He stopped. The wind moved through the oak trees at the edge of the yard. He said one more thing. "If you're there, please, I'm asking you, help me." The next morning, Lauren put a flyer on the kitchen table without saying a word. It was for a veterans group, at a church about 8 miles down the road. It met on Saturday mornings. Not a service, not anything preachy, just a group of veterans who got together and talked. Coffee and folding chairs and men who understood things that didn't need explaining. She said, "I'm not pushing you. I just thought you might want to know it exists." He almost said no. The word was forming. Instead, he picked up the flyer and looked at it for a long moment. And something from the night before, something from that porch, from those stars, from that prayer he'd barely believed in when he prayed it, something moved in him. He said, "What time does it start?" Lauren turned back to the sink so he wouldn't see her face. The group met in a room off the main sanctuary. 12 men, folding chairs in a circle, bad coffee that everybody drank anyway. A facilitator named Pastor Joe, who was himself a veteran, Army, 2 tours in Iraq, and who had the kind of face that had clearly been through weather and come out the other side. Marcus sat in that circle and didn't say a word for the first 3 weeks. He just listened. He heard men describe things he recognized. The hypervigilance, the isolation, the feeling of being in a room full of people who loved you and being utterly, completely alone. He heard a man named Gerald, 50 years old, built like a tank, talk about sitting in his truck in his own driveway for an hour because he couldn't make himself go inside and pretend to be normal. He heard a young man named Caleb, barely 25, talk about the moment he realized that surviving wasn't the same thing as living. And slowly, the way a fist slowly, reluctantly unclenches, something in Marcus began to open. On the 4th week, Pastor Joe said something that hit Marcus like a physical thing. He said, "A lot of us came home thinking we had to be strong enough to carry what we'd seen, that it was our job to contain it. But here's what I've learned, and what I've lived. Jesus didn't ask us to carry it. He asked us to give it to him. Not the parts we're comfortable with, all of it. The darkest parts, the parts we're most ashamed of, the parts we think disqualify us from grace. Those are exactly the parts he came for." Marcus sat in his folding chair and stared at the linoleum floor. The parts we think disqualify us from grace. He had never heard it said that way before. He had always assumed, without ever quite putting it into words, that what he'd done, what he'd seen, what he'd become in those places, had put him somewhere outside the reach of anything holy. That men like him didn't get grace. That grace was for people with cleaner histories. He drove home in silence. He sat in his driveway for a while. Then he went inside and found Lauren in the living room and sat down beside her and said, "I think I need to go back next week." She didn't make a big deal of it. She just nodded. But later he heard her in the kitchen, crying quietly, and then praying, thanking God in a whisper like she'd been holding that prayer ready for a long time and was finally letting it go. It wasn't a lightning bolt moment. Faith rarely is for men like Marcus. It was more like learning to walk again after an injury. Slow, sometimes painful. One week he'd feel something in that circle, a warmth, a sense of being held by something larger than the room. And the next week the nightmares would be back, and he'd sit on the porch and feel nothing. But he kept going back. Every Saturday. Bad coffee and folding chairs and men who understood. He started reading. Pastor Joe gave him a Bible, plain cover, nothing fancy, and Marcus read it the way he had been trained to read everything. Carefully, looking for what was real and what wasn't, testing it against what he knew about the world. What he found surprised him. He found a God who was not distant or polished or interested only in well-behaved people. He found a God who showed up in the wilderness, who walked with people through the valley of the shadow of death, not around it, through it, who chose fishermen and outcasts and men with blood on their hands, who looked at the broken ones and said, "You, I want you, exactly as you are." One evening, sitting on that same back porch where he had prayed in desperation, Marcus read the verse in Matthew where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He read it 3 times, and then he set the Bible down on his knee and looked out at the tree line and said, "Okay, I'm coming." No drama, no fanfare, just a tired man on a porch finally laying something down. But heaven noticed. I want to stop here and talk to someone watching this. Maybe you're a veteran. Maybe you understand from the inside what Marcus was carrying. The weight that has no name, the film that won't stop running, the feeling of being home, but not being home. Maybe you've been sitting on your own version of that back porch in the dark, too proud or too tired or too convinced that you're past the reach of anything good. Or maybe you've never served a day in uniform, but you know what it is to carry something too heavy for too long, to be strong for everyone around you while you're coming apart inside, to feel like what you've been through, what you've done, who you've become, puts you outside the boundary of grace. I need you to hear what Marcus found on that porch. There is no outside to God's grace. There is no version of your story too dark for him to enter. There is no weight too heavy for the one who carried a cross up a hill. There is no battlefield, literal or otherwise, where he has not already been. Where he is not already standing, waiting, arms open, saying, "Give it to me, all of it. I can carry what you can't." You don't have to be fixed before you come to him. You come broken, and he does the fixing. That is the whole story. That has always been the whole story. Marcus got baptized on the first Sunday of October. He stood in the water with Pastor Joe and he was shaking. Not from fear this time, but from something he was still learning the name of. Something that felt like being set down after a very long time of carrying. Lauren was in the front row with Abby on her hip. When Marcus came up out of the water, Abby, 6 years old, absolutely unaware of the weight of the moment, threw both arms in the air and shouted, "Daddy!" The whole church laughed, and then most of them cried. Marcus stood in that water with water streaming down his face, and he laughed too. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind his wife had not heard in longer than she could remember. She said later that she had prayed for that laugh every single night for 2 years. God had kept a record. Marcus still goes to that veterans group every Saturday. Except now he doesn't sit in the circle quiet. Now he's the one talking. The one who looks at the new guys. The ones with the straight backs and the 1,000-yard stares and the coffee they hold with 2 hands to keep from shaking. and says what somebody once said to him. He says, "You don't have to carry this alone anymore. There is a God who specializes in exactly this, in men like us, in the stuff we think disqualifies us. He's not afraid of any of it. He's been waiting for you longer than you know." He keeps the Purple Heart on his dresser now, not in a box, out where he can see it, not because he's proud of war, but because it's part of his story. And his story, all of it, the sand and the blood and the back porch at 3 a.m, and the folding chairs and the bad coffee and the water rising up around him on a Sunday in October, all of it led him here, to solid ground, to a faith he didn't inherit but chose, paid for with everything he had and found worth every cent, to a God who had been waiting in the Tennessee dark all along.